Creativity is effortful and it is difficult, it is challenging, but from those challenges come meaning and part of the reason why people engage in it in the first place.
Dr. Zorana Ivcevic Pringle is a senior research scientist at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Her new book is called The Creativity Choice: The Science of Making Decisions to Turn Ideas into Action. Now here's our interview. Well, Zorana, it's great to have you here today on the science of creativity.
Thank you for having me.
We have a lot to talk about because in your new book, you're just filled with creativity research. And I'm also a creativity researcher, but you have some really new perspectives and some great new stories that I wasn't familiar with. So I learned a lot from reading your book called The Creativity Choice.
Well, thank you. That is the best praise there is.
Wonderful stories in the book, and I want to hear some of them today. I wanted to start by talking about one of your stories. You are a baker, right? And you give several examples of cooking creativity in the book. So tell me a little bit about you and your baking.
Well, I started baking a little bit as a hobby, friends and family and going to a party. You have to bring something. What are you going to bring? How about a cake? And at first, I was just doing recipes the way they are written in a cookbook. And then I started to learn. I started to get a feel of what goes together. I have started to experiment a little bit, change recipes, combine recipes, that what we would call in creativity studies, mini C and little c creativity.
It sounds like that is, like you say, it's a choice to be creative. You could have been using the recipes and just continue doing it the same way every time, but you made that choice to try new things. Is that right?
Yeah, that it started with I want this recipe, but I don't like this part that is written down. So let me change that. And then I started getting curious in developing something on my own.
In your book, you have a lot of advice for people about how they can start doing that themselves in their everyday life. So, how can you do that? How can you be more like you or more like a person who's making those daily choices to be more creative?
I think that we have some barriers that prevent people from making those choices. And as I was looking into the literature, looking into the science of creativity, and trying to pinpoint why is it that some people have ideas and do something with them, develop them, end up with performances or products or something tangible, and others don't. To me, it seemed that it comes down to two big groups of psychological influences. One is risk. Creative work is uncertain by definition because we are trying to do something new. Creativity is something that is original but also effective in some way. So we are trying something new. And if we are trying something new, there is no blueprint. Pop psychology can tell you 6 steps to this or that. But in the case of creativity, it's just not honest and it's just not true. It is uncertain, and that uncertainty is experienced psychologically as risk. And the second barrier that people have is a sense that we don't have enough confidence. In the science of creativity, we call it creative self-efficacy, but the concept is similar. And that we don't have a sense that we actually can rise to the occasion and do something. I think in both cases, there are some faulty assumptions people made.
I like that about your book, that you don't lay out a 5-step or 6-step process. And I agree with you that books that do that, that's not an accurate representation of the creative process. What you do, or the way I would describe your book, is you talk about daily practices or mindsets, or I might think of habits of mind about how to be more creative.
Yeah, I thank you. That was my intention. And I think that another big issue are these false beliefs or myths about creativity, these ideas that float out in our culture that are actually not helpful.
Oh, you mean like the thought that only artists are creative?
That is the chief one, that only artists are creative. Whenever I hear people tell me, oh, that's interesting that you study creativity, but I am not the creative type. My insert relation is really good at drawing, with this whole assumption that creativity is about arts. And it certainly is about arts, but not only about arts. I think that is the most prevalent, widespread myth. But we mentioned this idea of confidence. I think there are some faulty assumptions there too. I think sometimes people start with the idea that you need to be fully confident to engage in something. You don't. You need just a kernel of it to get you started on a first task, on something that will get you going. And through action, by observing that we are able to rise to the occasion, we then build confidence further.
I think that brings us back to something you just said, creative self-efficacy, which is a really cutting edge area of research. Say a little bit more about what you mean by that, creative self-efficacy.
Creative self efficacy is the belief that you can successfully complete a particular creativity task. So it is not generalized. It is not you have creative self efficacy about anything in creativity. Like if you have creative self efficacy, doesn't matter that you believe you can create a still life painting and that you can start a new company. It is specific to task. So let's say that you are writing something, that will be a belief that you can successfully create a finished piece of, an essay.
But you also talk about in your book encountering obstacles as an important part of the creative process. So, how do you maintain your creative confidence or your creative efficacy, even if you're
Mm.
encountering these obstacles?
I love this question because the answer is you don't always maintain it. I gave a talk a couple of years ago to a room of experienced designers and museum designers, people for whom creativity is their every breath, essentially. And I got a question of how do you make sure you do not have doubt during the creative process? And the honest answer is that you cannot do that. You are going to have doubts, and your creative self efficacy will ebb and flow depending on what is going on in the process. And if you encounter a creative block at those particular times, you might not feel or believe that you can get out of it. It is not something that starts at one point and then only and ever goes up. At those times, you need strategies to get you out of it.
It's one of the attitudes or mindsets about creativity that you talk about right in chapter one, right after you tell your story about cooking. And it's how you cope when you encounter obstacles, because even the most creative people, the most successful people are going to be encountering these obstacles. And they know that, right? And they expect it to happen.
Exactly. And there is emerging research on self regulation in the creative process. And these understanding the nature of creative work, that it will include obstacles, that it will include times that are not going to be simply joyful and fun. There are going to be times that are either boring or frustrating or aggravating. Knowing that, accepting that, and understanding that it will happen is a first step in managing it and dealing with it successfully.
You say in your book that knowing about the creativity research and knowing about how creativity works actually makes you more creative, which as creativity researchers, we love that. And I think it's true, right? That's the sort of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it can. I don't think it always does. I think that knowing about the nature of creativity, knowing what the science of creativity says, can enhance your own creativity, but there needs to be an in between step of reflection and being purposeful and deliberate about how you approach the process. So, as I was writing the book, there were lots of these moments of meta reflection because it was important to me that the advice I was giving people and the tips I was giving people are something that I am able to do myself. Otherwise, it doesn't seem honest. If I cannot do it, why would I expect other people to be able to? And I have very much noticed that you need to stop yourself oftentimes in your habitual reactions. I'm an emotional person and I can get caught in my chain of thoughts and feelings. So you have to insert a moment and say, hey, this is not a helpful thing at this time. Remember those strategies. In those times, if you are reflective and if you insert that moment before a reaction, then understanding the science of creativity is going to really help your own creativity.
You mentioned emotions, and you use this phrase in the book, the emotional roller coaster. Uh, yeah, is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that creativity is oftentimes an emotional roller coaster. We oftentimes start with ideas. We have ideas. We are excited about ideas. And then comes that part when, well, we are not so sure how to develop them, what to do with them next. That can be anxiety provoking. It is unpleasant. At some point, we are going to encounter an obstacle almost by definition that happens in the creative process that is overwhelmingly frustrating. A few years ago, I did a study when I asked a group of creative individuals in diverse professions. They were artists, they were writers, they were designers, music composers, choreographers, you name it, and ask them what happens emotionally in times of creative block. And everybody, you could almost hear them scream, it's frustrating. And it was then interesting to see that for some, that frustration was tinged with anxiety, for some with self doubt, for others with anger, for others with self loathing. So what exact form it will take emotionally will depend probably on personality.
I'm glad you brought up that study because it's actually one of the things I noted here as a question I wanted to ask. And it's in chapter 8, which you call Overcoming Creative Blocks, where say a little bit more about that. You interviewed creative people and less creative people and compared them. Is that right?
No, this was a study where it was a survey study where I recruited a group of creative individuals in diverse professions and asked them about their experience of different times during the creative process. So I asked them what emotionally happens at time of inspiration, also what happens emotionally at the times of daily work, kind of daily grind. Now you're working to develop that idea, and then at times of creative block. And coming back to that idea of emotional roller coaster, in each of these cases, there was a lot of different emotional experience that people were mentioning. At times of inspiration, there is a lot of joy and excitement, love, but other things too, other experiences, such as nostalgia, such as sadness, such as pain. And at the times of developing concepts, developing ideas, it's a mixture of happiness and joy of creation, but also frustration. It is difficult. And creativity is difficult, although oftentimes coming back to that idea, sometimes what our culture is telling us about creativity can be misleading. There's a lot of portrayal in the media and in popular imagination of creativity being throwing paints against the wall and getting dirty and something completely spontaneous and joyful. There certainly are those times, but that is not the end of it.
And these are identified creative people, right, who are going through these emotions.
Yes, these are identified creative people who are all professional in their respective domains and very well accomplished.
I wonder how that goes along with the research on intrinsic motivation that you engage in creativity because you find these activities to be enjoyable. Maybe that's not the right word, though.
hmm I always wondered about that word. I'm glad that you're bringing it up because I think the word enjoyable is little bit misleading in a sense. It is not necessarily enjoyable in the very moment. I am a writer, I am a scientist, I do a lot of scientific writing, I do writing for communicating to the general audiences. The process of writing in itself, when you are sitting in front of your computer, can be less than pleasant. It is challenging. You write a sentence and then you rewrite it. And of course, you wish that you did it from the first try, but you don't because that's not how writing works. I would still say that it's enjoyable, but on a different level. Not in that moment, but when you look back and when you say, yes, this is an activity I actively want to do. Another element of intrinsic motivation is challenge. It is something that I want to do and it is challenging. And then when I rise to that challenge, I feel fulfilled and I feel accomplished and gain meaning from it. I think all of that together is what intrinsic motivation does to us and why it fuels creativity so powerfully, although it's not necessarily that you are enjoying it in every single moment. Actually, probably you are not.
Absolutely. And I think maybe that's what you talk about when you say not knowing the research can interfere with your creative ability because you encounter these frustrations and negative emotions, and then maybe you just stop because it's unpleasant.
Yes. So if you took those emotions as diagnostic of your ability, you might conclude that, well, this is frustrating, it is difficult, and it's supposed to be joyful, it's supposed to be enjoyable. If I truly had intrinsic motivation, I would be experiencing that. You may misinterpret it and say, well, therefore I don't have the ability, I should not even try. That's the pitfall.
In your chapter 6, which is the first chapter about emotions, you've got a couple of chapters. You talk about harnessing the power of emotions. And how can people do that?
That is, if I had to pick one chapter, that is probably my favorite chapter, or in a way the most important one, because it's giving insights that are rather non-intuitive to people. Emotion scientists consider emotions to be information. And when I say that sentence, it is confusing. What does that mean? Emotions are information. Well, it means that emotions have a purpose to them. They are telling us what is going on inside our mind, inside our bodies, and in our environment. They are telling us something. They are experienced as an automatic reaction. They're not actually so automatic. And if we learn to very granularly, very specifically identify emotions, then we can get some clues about potential action. So, for instance, if you do not just say, okay, I'm feeling negative, or I'm feeling bad, or I'm feeling stressed, that generalized word that we oftentimes use, but you say, I'm feeling frustrated. Well, that's telling you something. Frustration tells you that what you have been doing so far did not work. The point that you reach is, well, you hit the wall and it's not going on anymore. So if you listen to it, you have a hint of your next action. Instead of working harder, you have to find a different way of approaching a problem.
It's a self-awareness. It's an understanding of yourself, right?
Yes, it's an understanding of yourself and also understanding of the nature of emotions. What are different emotions telling you? So you need understanding of yourself to identify specifically what's going on, and then knowledge of, oh, this is the message here. And then another way that we can harness the power of emotions is by knowing how different emotions relate to different kinds of thinking and then use it to our advantage. So, to give you an example, when we are in positive, energized moods, we are really good at expansive, broad, quick bursts of original thoughts. We can think widely, broadly. But when we are in more subdued moods, more a little bit negative, unpleasant, less than pleasant, and more subdued, we are better able to critically think. And if you imagine when you are feeling a little bit down or a little bit grumpy, you can identify everything that is wrong with everything. Now, that can be used to your advantage because there are times in creative work when you really need to find what is wrong with what you wrote, what is wrong with what you have developed, and so on.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. It's what I think you call emotion regulation. That might be a more technical term for harnessing the power of emotions.
So, with emotion regulation, we are trying to change what we are feeling. We are trying to influence the course of our emotions. When I'm talking about harnessing the power of feelings, I'm talking about another ability of emotional intelligence, and that is the ability to use emotions. So, when we are using emotions, we are not necessarily changing what we are feeling, but saying, hey, I'm feeling something and it can be useful for a particular purpose. So I am not a morning person. I get up in the morning and regularly, everybody who knows me knows I am not in a positive mood. I tend to be very critical. So the first thing that I do in the morning is I review things that I have written previously, or I review papers that need to be submitted or that are in early drafts, because in those kinds of emotional states, I can do that most successfully.
You mean first thing in the morning, your emotional state is more conducive to creativity?
Exactly. It is more conducive to particular task relevant to creativity that requires critical thinking and tearing apart those things that were previously developed.
It's a matter of, I guess, alignment. So if you understand yourself better and then you understand the creative process, you know that different emotions are appropriate at different times in the process.
I love the word alignment. You could also call it matching the mood to the task and really using the power of different moods being related to different kinds of thinking. Because oftentimes, and many of us have essentially infinite to do lists. You might have the just right task for that mood that you're experiencing.
Then you could go out and pick the task on your list that you think is going to be good for you right at this moment.
Exactly.
I think it ties in with one of the important themes of your book is to de-emphasize the big idea that people think you're supposed to have at the beginning of the creative process. And this big idea is what's going to lead to creativity. But you de-emphasize that and you focus more on the extended process of creativity.
Of course, ideas matter. Ideas matter, and they are important. But I think that we are oftentimes talking about creativity only in terms of ideas and neglecting other parts of the process. That creates an impression that only if you had an idea, well, the rest would just come. And I wanted to put that upside down because there are a lot of people, there are a lot of instances when ideas are there, but then all of the rest does not happen. And another important thing to remember is that sometimes, actually, oftentimes, almost as a rule, we start with one idea, and then in the process of working on it, developing it, and building it, there's so much zigzagging. You use that term in your writing, that idea changes. The idea that you start with is not the same that you end with. And that part is important to remember if we are ever going to um, develop creativity that is not just the ideas, but something that happens with them.
It's the same thing that artists and designers tell me when I do interviews. A lot of them will say, it's not about the idea. You can make any idea good if you, it's about the process that you use to engage in the activity of being creative.
Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite studies of creativity of all times, and it's of all times and of old times, it is from the early 1970s, a study by Jacob Getzels and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, what they called problem finding. And in that study, they recruited a group of art students at the Art Institute of Chicago, brought them into the lab, and everybody had the same task: create a drawing of a still life. They were provided with a large number of possible prompts, and they could choose anything. So researchers observe students as they are creating these drawings and found that those who were in the end the most creative, whose drawings were the most creative, ended up engaging in a particular kind of process, in a process where they would take some of the objects that were provided to them and then arrange them, stand back, rearrange them, feel them, weigh them, compare their textures. If they had some mechanical parts, work the mechanical parts. Think about it. In a still life drawing, you are not going to see any dynamic working of mechanical parts, but they still did it, and that made a difference in how creative the drawing was in the end.
I really like that concept in that research. And it's your chapter 5, which is about problem finding. And in that chapter, you talk about Pixar, the animation studio. Tell us about how they engage in creativity and um, the role of the idea in their process.
I love Pixar as a consumer, as somebody who enjoys their movies, and Ed Catmull, who was one of the founders of the studio, wrote a book, Creativity Inc., a few years ago about the process of how Pixar creates, and I highly, highly recommend the book. It's one of the best creativity books I have ever read. It really touches on everything that is experienced and that we have studied. So their work really illustrates this process of problem finding. It's not that they are starting with an idea and then just go on and they implement the idea. Oftentimes when I talk to audiences, they say, oh, you really mean to talk about the process of implementation. And I object to that and I challenge that, because it's not just that you have an idea, the idea is static, and then you implement it or build it. It is that you are exploring it, you are developing it, and in that process it changes. So I love the story of the movie Up, which is just happens to be my favorite Pixar movie. Originally, the idea was to be about two brothers who are vying for their father's approval in this outworldly kingdom. None of that survived the process. The original idea was completely changed. The only thing that survived was a vision of how to connect in a world that may be alienating. And that's the only thing that really survived. All the details of it, everything how it was expressed, changed in the process.
And the ideas emerge from the process. That's the way I understand your story.
Yes, the ideas emerge from the process. It's not the most productive thing, is not to say, oh, let me come up with ideas, but oh, how can we think of this problem and how can we think of this problem in different ways? With different images in case of creating the movie, with different ideas in writing, and so on.
I agree with you that Ed Catmull's book called Creativity Inc. is a phenomenal account of the creative process. In fact, the second episode of this podcast, I talk about Toy Story, the very first Pixar movie, and how the original idea was very different from the movie that we know and love.
Mm-hmm. I ran across a YouTuber who said, isn't it interesting that this company that does wonderful movies made these changes? And the subtext was, isn't it strange that this is what happened? But it's not strange. That is how the creative process works. You start with a kernel, but that kernel oftentimes doesn't even survive.
How can you learn to do that better? How can you learn to engage in a process where ideas emerge?
It is hard. It is hard to engage in a process where you do exploration first without putting that pressure on ideas, solutions now. The reason why it oftentimes doesn't happen, it's not because people are not capable or necessarily even willing. It is we have lots of pressures on our time, pressures to be done quickly. I think we need to teach people that this is important if you are interested in a truly creative outcome, that it is going to be beneficial to engage in this process of exploration. And that would increase the willingness for them to do that. But there is a sense that if you do that, you are not making truly progress, and then you don't have anything to report. And if you have to report to your supervisors or whoever quickly, then you essentially are not given permission to engage in truly creative work. They might be saying they are interested in creativity, but they are not doing so in action.
It sounds very anxiety provoking.
It is very anxiety provoking. And that is why oftentimes it doesn't happen. A colleague of ours, Ronnie Ryder Paulman, recently published a study that I absolutely loved. They had problem solving teams. So it was several people working to solve a problem, provide solutions, evaluate solutions, choose solutions to different problems. And they have found that those who were successful spent most of their time discussing the problem itself, in framing it different ways, checking in whether the understanding of it is the same with different team members, and if they are identified disagreements or discrepancies, discussing them and trying to reconcile them or find where the discrepancies are coming from. 53% of time in team conversations were spent on that. for those who were successful in solving the problem. And it sounds like you are not doing anything, right? You're just checking in, but you are doing a lot because you are seeing different perspectives. And from that, solutions emerge.
Well, it seems like if everyone has a incorrect or less effective understanding of the problem, then you're going to be more successful if you, I don't know, realize that and then reframe the problem.
And it might not just be an incorrect view of the problem. It may be, and this is oftentimes the case in creative work, where problems are ill defined. There isn't just one way of looking at the problem, and there isn't just one possible solution. You are going to see different views, maybe combine perspectives, maybe learn from different perspectives, maybe even come up with some seemingly contradictory ideas that can be put together, which is a hallmark of creativity.
I love this conversation, and I can see how everything we're talking about fits into your framework of the creativity choice. In each case, you have to make a choice about which path to take.
That was the whole idea behind the book, that at every point in the creative process, you can make a choice to continue on the path of doing something that is likely to be original and effective in some way, or because of all the pressures, because of all the anxieties and all of things that are completely real, that boss is really waiting for you, slide into something that is more conventional. Perhaps it can still work, but it will be less of a contribution and less creative in nature.
One of the choices that you talk about is that you might be more creative if you create constraints for yourself, to impose constraints on yourself. And you acknowledge that it's counterintuitive. So, yeah, how do you do that? How do you know when it's the right time to impose constraints on yourself?
There was recently research about myths about creativity, and one of the very frequently endorsed ones was the idea that creativity is the highest when we have full freedom of action. Actually, about 70% of people across 6 different countries said so. And that it is very intuitive because we are associating creativity with something that is unusual, and therefore it does not follow those rules of, typical math test that there is one solution and there is a way to get to that solution. So therefore, freedom of action and freedom of thought. But that might not be the case. So, studies in design, for instance, have shown that imposing constraints, like designing a toy, and you have full freedom, well, where is your mind going to go? Well, it's going to go to what are the categories of toys? What kind of toy in those categories might you create? And chances are you are going to do something that is relatively obvious because you have to start somewhere. And mind, by the way it works, starts with something familiar. But if you are provided shapes that you have to use in your design, and you are asked by researchers to use those specific shapes, then, well, those shapes are not obvious. They've been selected to be relatively random, and now you have to incorporate them into your design. Well, you will be, by definition almost, forced to do something that is original. So that's how creativity can benefit from constraints. It is starting your thinking not at the most logical, most obvious place, but it's starting it at the place that is more remote from that what has been always done.
I love that story, and it's in chapter 4 of your book. It's about an experimental study of designers, right? I think they're professional designers, and you give some of them more constraints than others, and then you find that the ones with more constraints actually come up with more creative toys. I love that.
And it gets even better because they had multiple conditions where some people were randomly given. They actually had a 20-side dice to and randomly rolled the dice and had to use particular kinds of shapes. And some of them could choose some of those shapes, and some of them had to use all of them. And more constraints, having to use all of them made you even more creative because it forces you to make connections between things that otherwise you would not.
It's like a chapter in my new book called Learning to See. And the title of the chapter is Constraints. And it's about what professors do in schools of art and design. And a lot of them give their students constraints because they think students will be more likely to engage in a successful creative process.
And that is the case across different domains of work.
It was a new idea for me that you could impose constraints on yourself as well. And fascinating to think about how you might do that. So, yeah, can you give us some advice about how does a person know when they don't have enough constraints or when it's time to think about a constraint they might put on themselves? How do you know when it's the right time to do that?
If you want something that is original, think of how you can impose a constraint. I think you can start with that assumption. Imagine a situation like an everyday situation. So let's make something that everybody experiences at some point. Your best friend is having a birthday and one of the big ones, and you want to gift them something that is creative. You are not going on one of those infinite lists online of gifts for type of person X, pretty much whatever type of person you think somebody is, they're some kind of list. But you want something that is going to be deeply meaningful and creative. So what do you do? Well, I'm just going to share a personal example. I had a friend who recently had a 50th, and I said, well, the gift is going to be a story, and the story will be told through 5 objects, and 5 objects will represent the decades of our lives. So now you have some structure, and it forces you to stay within that structure. So, okay, now you think of each decade and you think of what is meaningful, what you shared in those decades, or what was important, and then you create the story from those 5 objects. You can apply a similar thing in your professional work or in your everyday life.
I think anyone could use that. You're exactly right. So it's either pick 5 things, which is completely unconstrained, and you might just, I don't know, be lost because how am I going to think of 5 things? But then you put on this constraint, pick one from each decade of your life, and then, yeah, I can see how the ideas are going to come to you better with that constraint.
You can impose more constraints. You can say it's going to be a book from each of the decades, or it's going to be a piece of music. Depending on what resonates with you and what is relevant for your context, you can impose different kinds of constraints.
All of this decision making and, and choices that you have to make, it seems like now that you're engaged in a process through time, that you're always making choices. And that sounds effortful to me that you have to be constantly aware of yourself and constantly thinking about what sort of choices you need to make at this time.
Creativity is effortful and it is difficult, it is challenging, but from those challenges come meaning and part of the reason why people engage in it in the first place. There are things, they are practices, they are habits of mind and mindsets that become more natural. I don't like to use that word because it sounds like woo woo, but feel less effortful. So when you are first building your capacity for creativity, you are reminding yourself at different steps. This does not indicate that you do not have the ability. This is just normal part of the creative process. You can very purposefully and effortfully do that with time and repeating it enough times through different actions and through different creative projects, tasks, or work. It's going to become less effortful. But some of it, this managing the process, it's going to become less effortful, but the work itself has to be effortful and difficult because you are trying to do something that hasn't been done before, or that at least you haven't done before. Definition of creativity.
I like to end our interviews by asking you if you have some specific advice, a piece of advice that our listeners could take with them and use in the next week or two to enhance their creativity.
There are few things to remember when you aim to do something creative. The first thing is that first ideas are rarely, if ever, the most creative. And remind yourself not to be satisfied even with a reasonably sounding idea that you first come up with. Then the other point is that you can make a decision, you can make a choice, you can ask yourself, how can I look at this creatively? How can I do something to approach this in a way that will result in creativity? Perhaps that is imposing constraints. Perhaps that is reaching out to your social network and reaching out to those people who you don't normally talk to get different perspectives and new ideas. Depending on where you are in your work, that might take a different shape, but you do have agency and you can proactively make choices.
Well, Zorana, thank you so much. That's great advice. And thank you for being on The Science of Creativity.
Thank you for having me, Keith.
I highly recommend Zorana's book, The Creativity Choice. It's well written and it's fun to read. It's solidly grounded in the field of creativity research, and I recognize a lot of the studies and concepts in the book. But even so, I learned some new things, and she told new stories of creativity that I wasn't familiar with. You can tell from our interview that she's a gifted communicator, and she knows how to translate the science of creativity into everyday language. Zorana's book has creativity advice that all of us can use. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.